The crew threw down the Black Doctor's bag. Soon, their $520 million insurance policy was gone. The Delta Airlines letter, a white, thick sheet of paper, was like a ticking time bomb, weighing heavily on the mind of David Clarke, who held the most powerful position on the board, but who was also facing a terrible internal struggle. David sat there, silently staring at each bold line, his eyes never leaving the paper, as if trying to find a way out. A right decision between the hundreds of millions of dollars and the human consequences that he knew he could not ignore. The alarm clock on the table ticked steadily, like the beat of a heart that could not sleep, reminding him of every passing second of his sleepless night. Next to the cold cup of coffee that he had not yet finished, David's heavy breathing was imprinted on the gloomy space. The deep wrinkles on his forehead could not hide the burden of responsibility he was carrying. Every minute that passed was a step closer to the final decision. A step that could change not only the fate of a giant contract, but also the lives of people whose lives were deeply affected by that choice. In that heavy silence, the story begins to unfold, not just about numbers on paper, but about lives, dreams, and a sense of justice waiting to be restored. It is a struggle between power and conscience, between economic pressure and human values, and David Clarke, the man with the letter, is at the center of the inevitable storm. Elaine Johnson had no time to slow down. Her steps hurried through the crowded crowd in Terminal C of the airport. Every time her hand tightened on the shiny black medical case, so heavy that one could feel the weight of a life lying inside, the neatly affixed emergency cardiac surgery kit sticker seemed to glow quietly in that chaotic space, like a reminder that inside it was a fragile hope of life. The sudden ringing of her phone from her compact bag pulled Elaine out of her thoughts. She glanced at the screen, pressing the snooze button without hesitation. Each ring was a harsh reminder that time was ticking away, a race against life, and she, as the keeper of life, could not afford to lose. Under the dim light, sweat began to bead on her forehead, seeping into her loose silver hair as if trying to resist the invisible pressure. It was not a sign of physical fatigue, but the pressure of responsibility weighing down on her shoulders, making every second and minute more precious than anything else in the world. Every breath, every step Elaine took was filled with urgency, as if she were to be slow for even a moment, the life she carried on her shoulders would sag and die. All around, eyes were on her, some curious, surprised by the haste, and some seemingly carrying a secret admiration for the older woman. Some could not hide their respect, because they knew that Elaine Johnson was no ordinary woman. She was a renowned cardiologist who had saved hundreds of lives in operations that seemed impossible. But to Elaine, all of that was just a pale backdrop in this dramatic moment, when every breath and step carried an unshareable responsibility. The entire airport seemed to be immersed in a separate timeline, where the chaotic sounds of life were overshadowed by the solemn silence in her heart. The watch fastened to her wrist kept moving, each second hand like a drum urging her on, pulling Elaine forward at an unstoppable speed. Inside the medical case were not only complicated instruments and equipment, but also the light of a chance to live, the only chance for a young boy waiting for help. Before Elaine, there was no room for delay, hesitation, or weakness. All that remained was a short but responsible journey, from the hurried footsteps to the alarm clock reminder and the attentive eyes of passers-by. In the hustle and bustle of the airport, Elaine's heartbeat remained steady, a quiet, steady beat, just like her, dedicated, responsible, and never succumbing to pressure. This was not just an ordinary trip, but a silent battle against time, against life and death, where she was the vanguard, the keeper of the flame of hope for an unfinished future. Tyler stood guard at the check-in counter, his eyes fixed like an invisible wall blocking any explanation, any outburst of emotion. When Elaine Johnson approached with the medical case, a symbol of life and hope, Tyler just looked at her coldly, his voice emphasizing each word as if he were repeating a mechanical process, nothing more, nothing less. "Sorry, you have to check a second bag. We don't allow more than one piece in the cabin." The words echoed through the crowded space, causing the hurried footsteps to suddenly stop, the eyes of passers-by to turn towards them. Elaine kept her confusion and concern in her voice as she tried to explain that the bag contained emergency heart surgery equipment that needed to be handled with care and could not be checked in the cargo hold. She spoke with urgency and respect, but Tyler just shook his head, unwavering. His body stood as straight as a concrete wall, not allowing any concessions to penetrate the rigid principles. The atmosphere around them gradually became stifling. The surrounding eyes began to turn towards them with curiosity mixed with concern. Some passengers whispered, exchanging strange glances, not understanding the reason for this indifferent stiffness. Everything seemed to freeze in that moment, when Elaine's dedication and responsibility clashed head-on with the mechanical, indifferent system. Tyler, though young and inexperienced, had the rigidity of someone who had memorized every rule but did not fully understand the value of what he was rejecting. This contradiction created an unbridgeable gap between the two men, between goodwill and the indifferent law. Elaine stood there, suitcase in hand, while Tyler raised his hand to point towards the baggage claim area. The cold reminder ringing out once more, like the muted voice of a system that didn't know how to listen. The tension quietly settled in, weighing down on the atmosphere that had been building in her mind since she stepped into the airport. In that moment, Elaine was no longer a famous cardiologist with life-saving hands, but just a woman standing before the closed door of indifference, a silent but meaningful struggle for life being given through each suitcase, each smallest action. Elaine's medical case, containing the most important heart surgery equipment, was not placed gently or carefully like the other luggage. Instead, it was thrown onto the checked baggage conveyor belt with a loud, crisp crash that echoed through the crowded airport, like a warning bell of the cruelty and indifference that was spreading. Lisa, the young flight attendant with a cold gaze, was the one who held the bag, then let it go without any respect, as if the object before her was just an inanimate commodity. Nothing more, nothing less. Elaine stood right next to her, her eyes suddenly downcast, her anxiety rising so fiercely that it choked her. She looked at the suitcase that was thrown away so roughly, as if she was seeing the fragile life of a human being threatened, her devoted care suddenly mercilessly discarded. All the emotions inside her seemed to be suffocated in an invisible moment, causing her heart to beat faster in fear and helplessness. The whispers of some passengers began to spread, like tiny drops of water that cracked the indifferent shell around them. They exchanged glances, knowing that this was not just a simple inconvenience, but a clear manifestation of disrespect and injustice towards Elaine, a person who carried the burden of life. The cold light of the terminal seemed to highlight the contrast between the coldness of the flight crew and the warmth and sincerity of the woman who was struggling to protect her vital luggage. The scene of the suitcase being violently thrown onto the conveyor belt is not only a thoughtless act, but also the starting point of a profound conflict, a battle between dedication and indifference, between human values and inflexible mechanical rules. The sounds of collision, the looks, and the whispers of the crowd of passengers create a vivid picture, both tense and full of emotions, that people cannot ignore or ignore. Elaine knew that this was not just a small incident, but a warning sign of even greater challenges that awaited her. In that seemingly brief moment, the seriousness of the situation became clearer than ever, making it impossible for her to forget and accept this injustice as simply normal. David Clarke sat at his desk, the dim light of the desk lamp reflecting on his face, etching lines of anxiety and tension. The report on the airport incident, which had just arrived, lay still on the desk, but it weighed heavily on his mind like an invisible stone. He raised his hand, holding his head, as if trying to push away the chaotic thoughts swirling inside, but could not avoid the feeling of torment, the heavy responsibility awaiting his decisions. His hands shook as he held the phone, his eyes fixed on the screen, where the huge numbers of the $520 million insurance contract haunted his mind like ghosts. This was not just a business contract, but a symbol of power, responsibility, and fairness that he had to uphold. With each passing minute, the pressure mounted, knowing full well that his decisions could affect thousands of lives, including innocent people who depended on the integrity of the company. Finally, with a deep breath and a determination fueled by a sense of duty, David placed the call to Delta Airlines Human Resources Department. His voice was warm but firm, clearly conveying the request for a full investigation into the incident involving the airport staff and the disrespectful treatment of Elaine Johnson. He did not stop there, but requested the immediate suspension of the insurance contract, a stern and warning move, in order to protect the values of fairness and human dignity. That moment, in the quiet of the office, seemed to mark a decisive turning point, opening a new chain of events that would change not only Elaine's life, but also the face of the airline. David's decision was not only a strategic business move, but also a symbol of the fight for justice, a powerful declaration that indifference and injustice will not be tolerated in any form. There was still a look of concern in his eyes, but also a glimmer of hope, the light of justice and change that he believed would come from this courageous decision. The story is not just about numbers or contracts, but rather a reflection of humanity and the core moral values that each of us must uphold. David Clarke, in that moment, became a symbol of inner strength and responsibility, ready to face any challenge to protect what is right. In the small, quiet, and stuffy hospital room, little Darius lay on the bed, his thin body and pale face reflecting the cold medical lights, like a fragile image in life. He was only 16 years old, a youth full of dreams, but now standing on the fragile boundary between life and death. Darius's heart had suffered severe damage for many months, making each beat a more difficult challenge than ever. This surgery was not only the only chance to save his heart, but also the hope for a future without pain and limitations. Beside the bed, Darius's parents stood close, their hands clasped together, their eyes following their son's weak breaths with undisguised anxiety. They knew how urgent the time was, but there was nothing they could do but place their hopes in the hands of Elaine Johnson, a vascular surgeon, the only one who could perform a miracle. Not far away, in the carefully prepared operating room, Elaine stood silently looking at the photo of Darius on her phone, her eyes filled with burning determination. The countdown timer on the screen was like a nervous drum urging her not to delay, not to fail. Each instrument, each carefully prepared surgical kit was not just a tool, but also a symbol of responsibility, of the battle with time and life. In that moment, the entire world seemed to shrink, leaving only Darius, Elaine, and time. The relentless enemy that was racing against time. Every sound, light, and breath blended into a symphony that carried the weight of life, hope, and unshakable devotion. It was the beginning of a journey of life and death, where every step carried the dream of living, of continuing to embrace the bright future ahead. Elaine stood frozen in front of the baggage carousel, her eyes following the movement of the medical bag, which was the most essential luggage for the surgery she was about to perform. But instead of being placed gently and carefully, the bag was thrown roughly, hitting the conveyor belt with a loud bang, echoing in the silence of the airport. A feeling of anger rose in Elaine's heart, pain not only from the material damage, but also from the lack of respect for the life of the patient she was carrying on her shoulders. Stepping forward, Elaine resolutely approached Lisa, the stewardess with cold eyes and a challenging attitude. She tried to speak softly but firmly, explaining the urgency and importance of the bag, hoping for sympathy and support. But instead of receiving a response, she was only met with disrespectful disregard. Lisa did not even bother to raise her head. Her words were cold and stiff like an indifferent wall, blocking all explanations, making the atmosphere stifling. Unable to contain her emotions, Elaine choked up, trying to hold back the tears that were about to fall. A slight sob mixed in with her words that seemed like it was about to burst out at any moment. The injustice and heartlessness weighed heavily on her every breath, but she still stood firm, not letting herself collapse under the pressure. In the midst of the tension, a passenger stood up, his voice deep but resolute, defending Elaine and speaking out against such disrespectful behavior. The surrounding gazes began to shift from curiosity to sympathy, creating a wave of silent but strong support. Lisa, instead of lowering her voice or showing remorse, responded with a defiant look, sharp words, and undisguised arrogance. She seemed to assert her power, regardless of Elaine's pain and need, making the tense atmosphere more stifling than ever. It was not just a simple argument, but a symbol of the confrontation between dedication and responsibility, and the indifference and injustice that filled the dark corners of the system. This scene rings like a warning bell, inviting the audience to sympathize and take a deeper look at the cruelty that sometimes exists in seemingly well-organized machines. It is the climax, where human values collide head-on with coldness and injustice, opening an unforgettable turning point in the story of Elaine, Darius, and their journey to find justice and life. On the flight, while passengers were still reeling from the recent events, David Clarke, with a calm but authoritative demeanor, stepped into the middle of the cabin, his voice resounding clearly, without a moment of hesitation. He announced the decision to suspend Delta's cooperation contract with the major insurance company. A drastic step not only to correct a serious mistake, but also to demonstrate an uncompromising commitment to fairness and respect for human beings. Immediately afterwards, under everyone's watchful eyes, David announced the dismissal of flight attendant Lisa, who had displayed a defiant and disrespectful attitude on this very flight. Murmurs began to spread, but soon there was a loud applause, ringing out as a collective consensus for Elaine, for justice being restored amid the ordeal. Not only that, the Delta representative also sent an official apology to Elaine and all passengers as an acknowledgement of responsibility and a commitment to change from the bottom of their hearts. Amidst the emotional atmosphere, Elaine received her medical bag, her inseparable companion during the long and arduous journey. The bag was returned intact, without a single scratch or damage, as a gentle consolation amidst the trauma she had just experienced, bringing her a deep sense of relief, as if justice itself had cared for and protected the most sacred things in the medical profession. Not only that, in another place, Darius's surgery was a great success. The image of Elaine embracing his parents, tears mixed with laughter and a grateful kiss, was the most eloquent testament to the perseverance and courage that overcame all challenges. The surgery not only saved a life, but also lit a flame of hope for many who witnessed this story. That justice and integrity will always be honored in the end, and courage will never be abandoned. The story ends as a powerful declaration of the power of truth, justice, and perseverance, not only in the aviation or medical industries, but in every life, every heart that stands up for justice. The story of Elaine and Darius becomes a living inspiration, reminding everyone that, no matter how great the challenge, integrity and courage will always be the guiding lights. David Clarke stood before the crowd, his eyes full of concern but steadfast, as if he were carrying on his shoulders not only the responsibility of a businessman, but also of a man who deeply understands the value of justice and compassion. He said, "Justice is not a luxury, but a solid foundation on which to build a civilized society. Empathy is not just a feeling, but also an action, a responsibility that each of us must shoulder with sincerity and perseverance. When faced with injustice, silence is not an option. It is the courage to speak up that brings light to the darkness." His words resonate as a heartfelt reminder that no matter how difficult life may be, we must never give up on our belief in justice and humanity. It is an invisible yet resilient force, a flame that never goes out, warming souls and guiding those who dare to stand up for the most sacred values of humanity. And above all, it is hope. Hope that every small act of perseverance and integrity contributes to creating a better world for all of us.